In this lesson, we'll learn about the structure and function of neurons. Neurons are brain cells. They operate with a combination of electricity and chemistry, and through the electrical and chemical nature of neurons, they generate our mental experience, including our perceptions, emotions, and memories. Now, we've learned to think of different brain areas as performing dedicated computations. So, for example, the fusiform face area seems to be processing visual inputs in a way such that it generates outputs that correlate to the identities of faces, the invariant features of a face, for example. Now, if we were to look at a computer chip at a microscopic level, we'd see tiny little electrical circuits. But what does a brain region, a bit of cortex, what kind of information processor is in this area of the brain? Well, it's a network of brain cells. So these are brain cells. They've been stained with a dark chemical, and the dark blobs are the cells. You can see they appear to be a tangled mess, but they are individual brain cells, neurons they're called. They have lots of branches, and it looks like a complicated architecture. But we want to think of this pattern of connectivity, and then the activity of these brain cells, a certain pattern of activity, would represent the computations that would be going on in that brain area. Right? So these cells are going to be receiving inputs from other parts of the brain, and the electrical activity of this network of cells is going to be computing some information, and the output of that computation will be sent to some other part of the brain. Here is one neuron, a hippocampal neuron, and it's been stained with a fluorescent dye so we can nicely see all of its extensions. There are some 80 to 90 billion neurons in the human brain. So lots of computational power. Neurons have basic parts, and we'll name them here in this slide. We'll start with the cell body. Remember, these are cells. These are living cells, and the cell body has the nucleus. Inside the nucleus is DNA, which has the recipes for making proteins. Proteins are the workers of cells. Coming off of the cell body are these branches. You saw all these branches here. We're going to call them dendrites, and we'll think of these dendrites as the receiving zone of the neuron. So other neurons in the brain are going to be making connections with this neuron here at these dendrites. The cell body then is going to have to integrate the information that the neuron is receiving from other neurons. And in a sense, then the cell has to decide what to do in response to those inputs. What the cell can do is generate an electrical signal that can travel down this fiber here called the axon. We'll think of this as the output cable of the neuron. And that electrical signal then can reach the terminal, at which point chemicals can be released, and these chemicals can alter the electrical activity of the target neuron, in the next neuron in the chain. So in a sense, we want to think of a neuron as making a decision. It's doing a computation. It's receiving information at its dendrites from other neurons, and it has to decide whether it's going to generate an electrical response in response to those inputs. It may not generate electrical response, and if it does generate a response, how intense should that response be? How many electrical signals should be generated in response to the activity at the dendrites? Here's another look at this idea of a neuron processing information. The dendrites are collecting electrical signals from other neurons, and again, we'll figure out what that means in a moment. The cell body is going to integrate information that it is receiving across all these dendrites, and then the axon is going to carry the output signal, which will be delivered at the terminals. Now, what happens at that terminal? Here we see the yellow neuron and the green neuron. That junction, that connection between the two, is called a synapse. Now, it's not a physical connection here. There's a space there. But what happens when electrical signal reaches that terminal, chemicals are released. And these chemicals, they're called neurotransmitters. These chemicals can alter the electrical properties of the target cell. So they can either excite the target cell or inhibit the target cell To excite the target cell would to make this cell more likely to generate its own electrical signal. To inhibit the cell would be to make it less likely to generate an electrical signal. So neurons are operating with a combination of electricity. That's this idea of an electrical signal being generated by the cell and carried down the axon. And then chemistry, that's the idea that chemicals are released across this space here. These chemicals can then alter the electrical properties of the target cell. Can electrically excite the target cell or inhibit the target cell.